Good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Welcome to this session, end of day session, Saturday of the Rencontre Échos. My name is Dominique, so I'm an economic journalist, and we will discuss the following topic, research as a geostrategic issue. Now, to discuss this point, and I will give you a further introduction later on, Etienne, who is a scientist. He's a scientist. Good evening, and academic economist specialized in research. Paula, STEPHAN. Hello, who should be on screen soon. Good afternoon, madam, or good morning, probably. And the Béatrice WEDER de MAURO from Switzerland, and you're in Singapore. We should see you any minute now. I think it's middle of the night in Singapore. And a French economist, Philippe Martin, who president or vice president of the Council of Economic Analysts in Paris. Now, we experiencing quite a specific crisis. What happened in the last four months is a great, amazing illustration of all the questions we may ask ourselves about progress, science, outcomes, and results of discoveries and research, scientific research efforts. We expected a lot about the treatment and vaccines. There's been public debate about the most complicated drugs, and there were even opinion polls asking the French population what they thought about such or such drug or medicine. Those are very specific situation. Research, indeed, is a strategic element. It is a scientific, political, but is there an economic approach of such issues? What does economy tell us about those main issues, battles between continents, nations, and of course between private research and public research? These are the questions we're going to discuss. Like all the other sessions, this one will be done this way. The economist from the Cercle economists will take the floor, Philippe Martin. Then each speaker will have 5 minutes, and then there will be an open discussion together, and then we'll try to answer the questions coming from the listeners or those who look at us on the internet. Philippe, you're on. Thank you, Dominique. Well, just to kick off the discussion, I'd like to define the scope of the subject and discussing vaccines. This is quite a crucial element now in the aspect between private research and public stakes or goals. This is a debate on vaccine in the COVID crisis, and I'm actually astonished about the lack of questioning as to the best way to speed up the development of such a vaccine. Now, of course, there is research, but the production of the vaccine, because if I understood well, there is a lot of research, but the whole production process, which is very costly and difficult to control. As an economist, of course, we know there is a sanitary goal, but there is a huge economic goal because there is no return to normal economic life without the vaccine. We can see that. So there's been assessment. If we could advance by 1 month the discovery of the vaccine, we could save 200,000 lives and potentially something like $400 billion. So it's actually gigantic in terms of even by 1 week or 1 month, the discovery of the vaccine would be essential. So I'm somewhat surprised by the fact that in all the recovery plans that we hear about, not much is being said about the vaccine. And economists did ponder this question. We discussed that during the AIDS crisis about the fact that, for example, if we allow the market forces act and the private laboratories do the job, we will not have enough resources and we won't have enough money to find a vaccine, simply because there will be, there are huge financial risk for laboratories. This is what happened at the time of SARS. There was not enough research, and in fact, they couldn't find vaccines, and in fact, they realized that it was extremely costly, extremely risky for them to do, for their business model to do this. And Michael Kramer, one of the Economic Nobel Prize winner, said there is a vacuum right now. We don't have enough public money for this question, and one of the topic, of course, is the risk of expropriation for several labs which do research. And this is why we're worried about the fact that there is not enough research going on the vaccine and on the production processes. So proposals are coming up from Michael Kramer, but also from Pierre-Yves Joffard in France. And they said that the best way possibly to find a solution to this market failure is to there would be purchasing commitment from governments for patents. So there is little coordination being at the national level, and the amounts apparently, this is what some economists say, are not sufficient versus what is at stake. Again, just to save 1 week or 1 month in the discovery of vaccine would be essential. So simply I wanted to highlight this dimension, and it says the links between private research and incentives that we could give to private research and a public stake, which is, of course, which is at its height. So keeping, okay, I didn't have this in mind, but maybe some viewers do not understand the fact that if we save, well, okay, as you said it, I didn't know the figures. If we save 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks for the discovery of the vaccine, it will have a huge impacts in terms of public health and also in terms of the economy. I will now give the floor to Béatrice Weber di Mauro, who is in Singapore. She's a Swiss-Italian economist. She has an amazing resume. She taught just about all over the world in the IMF, World Bank, first women of the Council of Economic Experts, and today you are, Madam, the director of the Center for Economic Policy Research, which is the major European network of economic research. The question I would like to ask you, Madam, is that as a response to the question posed by Philippe Martin, well, the research networks and the economic networks, public and private, are they in a financial situation in terms of organization to move forward faster for the discovery of a vaccine? But of course, it's a broader question.
Having me on this panel. You are asking all the right questions. How can we advance research as fast as possible in this period when it's become very, very obvious, in fact, that research in the life sciences, and in particular, as Philippe was pointing out, in the speed in finding a vaccine is absolutely crucial. And let me also emphasize that it is a geostrategic issue, because it will matter where this vaccine is found, who has it first, and how it will be distributed. There, we should not have any doubt about that dimension too. Now, the points I was going to make are complementary, in the sense that the Center of Economic Policy Research that I lead and that you mentioned is in fact a network of economists. And in this particular crisis, what we have seen is that there was a need, and there continues to be a need, for interdisciplinary
Alors, est-ce que la question peut être résolue?
Research, and in particular, medical professionals, epidemiologists, and economists have had to come together in order to bring to the table expertise in order.
Le mieux, c'est de le diffuser en anglais, alors.
Excuse me, were you asking something?
Est-ce que vous pouvez diffuser le son en anglais?
Sorry, madam, we do have a problem of voiceover, so we're trying to solve the technical problem. I'm sorry, we'll try to do the broadcasting in English only.
Okay.
Est-ce que quelqu'un de la technique peut manifester un signe de vie? Nous sommes désolés, Béatrice, il y a, et semble-t-il, un problème technique dans la traduction.
It will be a technical problem. We hear we have a loop, we have a feedback loop. So can the technique solve the problem, or maybe we'll ask Etienne KLEIN to take over. But it'd be good for the technology to tell us what is going on. We'll get back to you, Béatrice. We're very we're very sorry.
Est-ce que
So you talk a lot around scientific questions. You talk a lot to the French public, and you've written 30 or so books. You're very well known for all of these questions. This week you published a book called The Taste of True, and it's a reflection on what happened with the COVID. What are the feelings of a scientist as to our collective experience in terms of expectations of results around treatment and research? So thank you for giving me the floor. I think that we're talking about research as if there was only one research, but there are different sorts of research. And in particular, research to find a vaccine when a new virus appears is crucial. It's urgent. And there are vital economic stakes. And we have to rise and meet the challenge of a health crisis. And all of the researchers exchanged data. We work together a lot faster than usual without compromising scientific methodology. And there is another type of research which aims to answer questions raised by a community with regard to different communities. So there are discoveries that are made. So we can think about a discovery in 2012. There was a very old question: where do the mass of particles come from? And after 48 years of research, we discover a particle that allows us to understand this mechanism. So in fact, it's a time difference which is tremendous between the expectation of the entire world for something that the scientists cannot answer. Yes, they have to undertake research because they don't have the right answers to bring to the urgent questions. So what we do, so there's a time conflict in these situations between the time of research, which requires time to see if a treatment is effective and if there are no harmful side effects. You need methodology, you need to compare populations, you have to do double-blind experiments or randomized tests. It takes a long time. But the public is impatient, and therefore the systemic approach of the researchers, when they don't know how to say "I don't know," their voice is covered by those who don't know as much, but who speak louder a bit. And sometimes the results come along, they're contradicted, and then the general public is very confused. And they think that the research is a community of people who don't agree and who are getting arguments together, which is true at a certain point. But the idea is that at the end of the process, we must manage to understand a part of the reality. And of course, some questions still remain and others are solved. It seems to me that at the beginning of the crisis, we asked research to really comply with opinion and the idea that surveys are just as reliable as the discourse of a researcher. Or the floor is given to certain researchers who say certain things that we should trust more. We are supposed to trust more. So I found it very interesting. To begin with, I was very happy because I said, well, at last, we will... Yes, so there is a power struggle that has been reversed, yes. So we could, in real time, explain what a method is, what a double-blind test is, what does it mean, what does it involve from a statistical point of view. And very rapidly, we saw that this methodology that we could have adopted was overtaken by a sort of a background noise that overtook it. So there are two words we wish to set down in the discussion here. It is competition and cooperation. What is the most effective, and what have we seen over the past 4 months? And of course, this is still ongoing. We can imagine that competition between laboratories, between states and continents, United States, China, of course, and Europe, regarding treatments and vaccines, are profitable. It's not the right word, but effective. But cooperation is also required. Yes, we need both. There's an expression, co-optition. And so that's to translate the fact that research is not a question of individual demands or from a person who says what has to be thought. We should think about one or other phenomenon. So there is a friendly, hostile approach of citizens to the community of knowledge. So as long as we haven't decided upon the answer to a question, we have to discuss, argument it, and then at the end, we manage to answer the question. It can take a great deal of time. So, for example, the idea of the Greeks' idea of the atom in the 5th century BC and the experimental discovery of the atom, there were 2,500 years. So what Philippe said earlier on, there's a doubt as to the means for research and whether it was sufficient. So when we compare the means that were put on the table to protect or defend the economy, what about thousands of billions of euros and the means of scientific research? Of course, the scale is not the same. How can we find the right level? So when I heard Philippe talk about this economic criteria that is applies to research, whether we find a vaccine 1 week earlier or 1 week later, I didn't realize that the economic impact was so big. So it's very interesting to hear that. But we can speed up methodology, but we can't do away with it. So I'm not sure that even if we pour money into it, that it will really speed up the process. There are necessary steps that take a lot of time, and that money does not necessarily allow us to speed up. So we're going to make another attempt. We're going to come back to the discussion. Yes, no, the question is that we should have a lot of laboratories carrying out research on the vaccine, because if there are 10 or 100 labs, then it will change the probabilities of finding a vaccine. So it is a question of resources. Yes, that is the case. Yes, but there is some concern to the fact that they themselves are maybe not putting sufficient resources because the incentives are not there and the financial risks are too great for them. So we're going to make another attempt to join Béatrice in Singapore. Béatrice Veda de Moro, can you hear me? Is the translation working? And can we resume the intervention? Can the translation tell us if it is working, or whether we can maybe listen to your intervention directly?
I don't know whether you can hear me.
Oui.
Hello?
We can hear you, madam. We can hear you.
If you can hear me, I will continue and give my intervention. But I need a feedback whether you can hear me.
Oui.
We do hear you, madam. We do hear you. We do hear you.
So I was saying that it's absolutely crucial what you have been discussing in terms of the financing and the geostrategic importance of research in order to who finds a vaccine first. The other point I was going to make is that in this crisis, we are also seeing that research in broader dimensions, in particular also research of economists and working together between economists and epidemiologists and medical profession is absolutely crucial in order to devise the right strategies on how to deal with the crisis. So my experience of the Center of Economic Policy Research, which is a network of over 1,500 economists, has been that there has been an immense response from the profession to the call that we issued. And let me also put some numbers on this. The call to the profession was, let's put all the power of this network in order to help fight this battle and in order to help policymakers to make the best use of knowledge out there on how to be able to mitigate the economic impact of this crisis. And one of the instruments we actually launched at the Center of Economic Policy Research is a new journal, a collection of papers called COVID Economics. And we've had over 600 papers submitted within a few months and published over 300 papers that discuss the interaction between the medical interventions and the economic interventions. I mean, it's really, really impressive in this crisis to see how expert knowledge, research, and policy making are working together very, very tightly, hand in hand.
Ok, merci. Nous allons.
Thank you. We have a question for you, Béatrice, if you don't mind, from Philippe Martin. The experience I've had at the beginning of the crisis, at the advent of the crisis, in terms of economic research, that we wanted to understand what we knew based on the crisis of 2008-2009, but we realized that it had nothing to do with it. So the question I want to ask you, what is the rhythm? And it comes in line with what you were saying early on. That is the fact that there is a time gap between the question we are being asked, how we respond to the crisis, and the speed of research. I think we need we have to be modest in terms of research, in economic research, because there are many, many parameters we don't know. And I'd like your reaction for the question, because decision makers want answers now. What do we do now because of this crisis? And even more requirements in the health domain than in the economic domain. In the economy, governments expect, wait for economists to agree on the analysis and answers, but they give you a time, which could be a couple of years. We saw that in 2008, 2009, but in the sanitary problem, the expectation is much more urgent. Now, are research networks organized to go fast? Is it organized at its best in the world?
When it comes to economic research, my answer would be yes. If you look at the 600 research papers or so that have been submitted, and of which many are published, of course, they are basically, it's real-time research. But in economics, when we don't have data yet, at least we can model, we can try to model behavior of both individuals and of systems. So to give you an example, one of the underlying assumptions in these curves, in these contagion and epidemiological expansion curves of the disease, is that people do not adjust necessarily their behavior. There is simply a infection rate, an R naught, which determines the spread of the disease. Now, economists are very much inclined to and accustomed to thinking in behavioral responses and incentives. And in fact, what we found very quickly, and this has been integrated into the models, is the fact that people do actually also respond, even when governments do not regulate and do not mandate lockdowns. People do respond in their behavior because a sufficient number of people will be scared, will be defensive, will voluntarily social distance, and this has an impact. So even in countries where the lockdowns were not as extensive as in other places, we did see a decline in economic activity. We did see consequences for the economy that were stronger than one would have expected. So this is one example of something where research, both model-based and then data-based research, has provided a lot of evidence, and this then also informs, for instance, questions about the optimal type of lockdown going forward. Is it more important that you that you limit large gatherings, or school closures a better instrument? So these are things that economists study and where data.
Parfait, merci. Nous allons.
And here, of course, the networks again.
Nous allons revenir.
Are extremely useful.
Nous allons revenir à votre question.
And they are working.
Je vais poser. J'aurai une autre question.
I have another question to ask you in a couple of minutes on the relations between the public research, states, and laboratories, pharmaceutical laboratories. We now give the floor to Paula STEPHAN, who is comes from the Georgia State University. She's an economy professor. She has worked at the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and for a few years she was a member of the editorial committee of the review Science. And I will just give you put a question to you to start. How is it possible to better structure research, and how could we define what is a global common good? So this need for the vaccine that will be found should be a global common good. So what's the view of economy on this?
Well, I think it's important to realize that in many ways we entered this crisis with a research deficit in terms of basic research. Over the last 10 to 20 years, I think both the incentives that scientists face as well as the way in which funding is distributed has tended to be risk averse and has tended to invest less in basic research than would be ideal. And that's for a variety of reasons, I think, but we see it both in terms of European funding organizations. We definitely see it in terms of US funding organizations, this tendency for risk aversion. So I think it's extremely important as we go forward to realize that we need a portfolio of the kind of research we're doing and not completely focus on research that has short-term results, which I would argue one of the reasons that we focus so much on that has been the huge role that bibliometrics play in the way in which we hire scientists and promote scientists. And as I've shown in research with co-authors, we find that these kind of bibliometric measures really penalize risky research, particularly in the short term. Now, I think it's also important to realize that collaboration plays a huge role in scientific research. And one of the things I'm quite concerned about with COVID is that a lot of this collaboration, while it can occur by video conference or by email, a lot of it benefits from being in close physical proximity, and we've had a major decrease in the mobility of researchers that I think will really affect research currently. And there's nothing better in research than face-to-face interaction for certain situations, particularly where tacit knowledge, that is knowledge that's hard to communicate in a written journal article or by video conference, is involved. And it's important for scientists to be close together in that sense. I also want to say that we've been focusing a lot on the discussion on how much could be saved if we discovered a vaccine a week or a month or a couple of months earlier. And that's really important to think about, but I also think it's important to realize that we're not going to solve our problems with discovering it. We're going to have to figure out a way to manufacture it and distribute it. And that's where I think right now the government can play a major role in creating the infrastructure and getting the supply chain ready to be able to produce different vaccines. I mean, we have multiple vaccine research going on, and the government is going to have to hedge its bets. We're going to have to hedge our bets. So we have in place a variety of platforms to produce these vaccines. And then finally, let me say that I think it will be very important for the government and for researchers to continue to think about how we're going to convince the public to be vaccinated when we get a vaccine. I mean, one of the things that concerns economists and has certainly concerned epidemiologists has been the increasing aversion to vaccination. We would like to think that this crisis will change people's minds there, but that's not at all clear. And we know from research that a crucial percent of the population is going to have to get vaccinated for this to really work and to be effective in putting COVID out of the crisis mode. And the government has got to play a very, very large role there. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We're going to come back with a question, but I would like to ask Etienne KLEIN immediately to react to this point. What can explain in Western countries, and above all in France, quite obviously, that there is this aversion from the scientific community, and how this affects the vaccination? Well, it's a very broad question, but you remember at the beginning of the epidemics, a lot of people said, well, if one day we find a vaccine, all of the people who were averse to vaccination so far will accept to have the vaccination. It will be a sort of a lesson, because the effect of vaccination is that it makes the diseases that it protects from invisible. And so here there's a new disease, and a vaccine would allow us to rehabilitate the very idea of vaccination. But a recent survey showed us that it was not the case. There are certain people who continue to say that they will not be vaccinated. So what's interesting in this evolution is, why is it that people who fight against this or that cause say that they know or have all the knowledge? Because you can be pro or for or against nuclear technology, but you don't have the knowledge about it. You can say that you're for or against climate change without understanding the effects that it has. And that's what I believe is interest. So we're entering in a period where opinion is more important than facts. Well, the belief is more prevalent than the facts. And one question about research is, how can these results percolate in the opinion without being deviated by a lot of cognitive biases, which mean that what is understood is something other than what we were trying to explain. And this questions the way in which I've always tried to do an extension of this of information. It means that extension doesn't work. No, I've always tried to explain clearly, not simply but clearly, what I've tried to understand. The quality of the explanation should mean that the transmission of the information is loyal. But no, there are a lot of cognitive biases that throughout this propagation modify the message conveyed so that the global effectiveness, I'm not sure if we're able to measure it, but it's not very good. That's very worrying for coming years. If we say that what is happening today, first of all, will last and might repeat itself. Yes, because communication of knowledge and belief and comments and opinions circulate at the same time, and they have different cognitive statuses. But the fact that they are circulating along the same channels, for example, the social networks. So, for example, knowledge will be interpreted to be a belief on behalf of a particular community, and belief will be interpreted as something that reveals knowledge that we haven't taken seriously, etc. But it creates a general confusion, and I hope that we will end up by managing to get out of this situation, because things might be clarified. For example, the research results might be sufficiently unanimous so that the ambient noise comes to a halt, and that we collectively adhere to what has been found. But I fear that we're far from that. I have a question to ask Paula STEPHAN on the United States. Do you believe, and this is the impression we have in Europe, that there is an attitude regarding the fear of the virus that is very different in Europe, where the lockdown was respected, in Italy, in France, in Spain, and to a lesser extent in the United Kingdom? The syndrome of fear was effective, and that's why people complied with the lockdown. That's not the case in the United States. How do you explain this?
I think I put much of the reason for the United States is that total lack of leadership from the president and particularly governors who are of the same party that he is, to make this into a political issue rather than a health issue, and to declare wearing a mask to be politically incorrect in some sense, and to really make this a very divisive issue in the U.S. And I think a lot of the failure of the U.S. to deal successfully with this, and I would say we are not dealing successfully at this point with it. I live in a state where there's been a dramatic increase just in the last couple of weeks. I think much of it comes from leadership that has not respected scientific research and really has made it into different kinds of belief systems. So I think at least in the US, but I think this is somewhat true in the world, right now we're in a position where the public has lost a lot of confidence in science. Now in the US, that's partly because of the leadership that we have that has really not taken science seriously, never has in the terms of President Trump. But I also think that it's been fueled somewhat by scientists themselves. I'm very, very concerned that the public is losing confidence in scientists, and I think a lot of this has increased recently, where we see these articles that have been rushed to publication about certain kinds of treatments or certain databases that then turn out to be not correct and have to be retracted. And if at any time we really need it, we really need to have strong confidence in science. I hope the U.S. will have different leadership come November, but I think scientists also really need to work at building the public confidence, and I think this comes right back to the issue of vaccination. I don't think unless the public has strong, strong confidence in science and in the efficacy of this vaccine, that it will be as widely accepted as it should be.
I'm now asking questions to Béatrice. In Singapore, I have two questions. First, seen from Asia, you are now currently residing in Asia. How are the Western countries perceived in the way they manage the crisis? Are you somewhat astonished, surprised that to say that Western countries were not able to solve that issue before it spread? That's the first question. Second question is asked by someone who is looking at you on the internet, called Timothy Robert Fay, and he's asking the following question. The pre-ordering system implemented to develop a vaccine, don't you think that it is likely to reinforce the power of pharmaceutical labs to the detriment of that of the states?
So on the Asia question, definitely Asia has had more recent experience with pandemics, and in particular with SARS. So Singapore, Hong Kong, all of this region have a relatively recent memory of the SARS experience, and they did proceed very quickly with tracking and tracing methods, and the experience then was helpful. Also, China, as we know, was able to contain ultimately pretty much the virus locally, and again is reacting very strongly with the second scare and outbreak in Beijing. But nevertheless, here in Singapore, as is well known, ultimately in the second wave the virus escaped, and the reaction, although strong, has had to be much stronger also, not only in terms of isolation of the affected groups, which in this case are mostly migrant workers, but of the whole population. And this is, so in that sense, Singapore and other countries ended up sharing the experience of Europe with a national lockdown much more closely than initially one could have expected when it looked like the tracking and tracing was working, at least in certain places. I think the view from Asia and the view that I particularly have on Europe has been that there has been a very strong reaction of leadership, and that in many countries, in fact, leaders have been able to gain in stature and even in trust, because it was obvious these were problems that they had not dealt with. In many places, they did form groups of experts and these and were credibly being led by science. This is not the case for all countries. We know that in some countries, I mean, in the UK initially, also the dealing with the crisis was certainly not optimal and not necessarily science-led, but overall I think that
sur la seconde question,
Europe, and especially also now in the second phase at the European level, the EU level, there has been a strong response of leadership, and leaders have actually gained in stature and possibly in trust in the public. Maybe one point that I still wanted to make, about you asked about how is the allocation system going to be for the vaccine? I mean, that's the question that one has to ask here. No, is who is going to decide this, and how is it going to be distributed? That's absolutely a crucial question, and there are if there are going to be shortages of vaccines, it's very likely that first they will have to go to those most in need, medical personnel, etc. But then after that, it is also not unimaginable that one might have to choose some other allocation mechanism like random allocation.
Parfait. Merci beaucoup en tout cas pour...
Thank you very much for the... for Béatrice in Singapore. Thank you for your enlightenment, and we'll complete the finish discussion here in Paris. Possibly one question to you, Etienne. KLEIN, the lack of trust, the deficit of trust in science and on vaccine, does it impact the private sector, the pharmaceutical labs? Is there a mistrust as well as there is vis-à-vis the states, or is it science as a whole? I cannot answer that. I can't really give you a quantitative response, but I think trust, which is dwindling, comes to the fact that there is some kind of competition in our society between two current of thoughts in our societies, but which have quite a nasty effect, and they're actually mutually reinforcing. First is the call for truth, and the populations are over-informed and don't want to have discourse from economic institutional or state institution that would have advantage in deliver research or discourse. So now people do investigations, and it goes to theories of plots or conspiracy theories. The strange thing is that this wish for truth, which should serve the truth, research actually should lead to the identification. Or at least but when we face a truth, we reject the status, but is it not simply relative, cultural, ephemeris, contextual, instrumentalized? Is it not the word of one specific community? And therefore, the wish for truth and the denial of truth are working together, and it fragilizes not science, the trust in science, but in the speech, in the discourse of scientists. Maybe they say what they say because a pharmaceutical lab, it would finance them, and therefore there is some kind of a general suspicion, a doubt, and it comes to the fact that in fact we could identify proven truth. And this is it's impacting medicine, pharmaceutical lab. If you have an argument against the efficacy of such molecule, you know, recently promoted in few weeks, in those few weeks, we will suspect it to be an agent of the big pharma. Sorry, do you want to mention the name of Professor Raoult? You know, you don't want to give his name, but it's just an example among others. But Raoult is is form of relativism. You know, Philippe Martin will conclude with you now, president of the Council of Economic Analysis. How did you look at the way the state managed research? Resistant, we saw so many attempts and trials in all directions with conclusions which were difficult to obtain. We felt there was some kind of global confusion, absolute wish to get clinical trials in France, not so much European, in fact. You know, the European trial did not succeed. We've heard discussion, we've seen discussion between Sanofi and the state, you know, and there was a doubt from the public because the people felt that the state would not be able to find a vaccine, and Sanofi said they would privilege the US first to provide the vaccine to the population. So you are in the States and an economist. How do you feel about this? Well, I'm not in the, you know, I'm fully independent, by the way, vis-à-vis the government. So, no. What is true, though, is that there was failure on cooperation that was supposed to be organized by the states for several points, and especially the trials, clinical trials. Yet, I had a feeling that researchers themselves did cooperate a lot. So there is competition and cooperation, but in that respect, I didn't have a feeling there was a failure. There might have been failures in terms of European cooperation, clear enough, but among researchers, I don't think so. Let me come back to this point of trust. You know, we talked about the mistrust vis-à-vis experts, but bear in mind that in France, there's generalized mistrust scientific experts. You know, you have, you know, basically vis-à-vis the economists or journalists, you know, when you look at the surveys, the polls, scientific experts are still those who are considered as the least mistrusted. So I think there is a reduction of trust vis-à-vis the scientific discourse. And in fact, journalists also have a role to play in that respect to find, to have this discourse, the proper distance between the public and the scientists. For example, we don't have enough scientific programs on radio, on TV. We need that, and it's now. We do that at Radio France, we do that, but, you know, France Inter, France Info, France Culture. But anyway, well, clearly, we do have a problem of trust vis-à-vis the scientific discourse, but let me insist on the fact that there is a worst problem vis-à-vis the economist. It's an interesting issue. It's quite legitimate to discuss a conflict of interest. But it becomes an excuse to listen to nothing and to say, you know, all words, all discourses are the same, you know, and therefore there is suspicion, generalized suspicion. And the problem is that initially politicians delivered words of wisdom from the science, but now nobody believes anybody now, and you see what goes on with Trump, and therefore this devalorization of any form of discourse in the public debate that worries me deeply. So we have a collective task, you know, economic, scientific, and journalistic, and we can close on that note, rather pessimistic, but I'm sure we'll fuel discussions and possibly hope. Thank you for your attention. Have a good evening.